Hi everyone, a warm welcome to the show. My name is Alistair. I'm an SGLN ambassador, and I'm very happy that many of you are joining us today. Well, today we have Piyush together with us, and we are so honored to have him. Hi Piyush, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Alistair. It's wonderful to be with you again.
And today we'll be talking more about communicating as a leader. You had various leadership roles. Do you mind sharing with us just a brief one on your leadership journey? You were in CT before, you were in India, and after that in Indonesia and a couple of other places. You did a startup as well, actually, at the height of the .com. And after that, of course, unfortunate things might happen. Share with us. And then, you came into DBS. So curious to learn from that.
All right, let me just take a couple of minutes.
Yes, please.
I'm what I often call an accidental banker. I was not planning to join a bank. I thought I'd be a diplomat. But through a bunch of circumstances, I wound up working with Citibank. And very early, I realized that I loved the job. One of the reasons I like banking is it's a good general management discipline, and it allows you to strategize, but also execute across multiple domains, whether it's technology or people or pure finance. I realized early in my career the power of communication, and I'm going to tell you 2 or 3 anecdotes. The first was about written communication. I always thought I wrote well. I had studied in a good Irish Catholic convent schools. I could spout Shakespeare. I wrote poetry and I wrote articles for the press. I thought I was good. I debated. And in my first few months, my boss told me that I wrote terribly. And he used to actually call me to his room, his cabin, and I'd write these memos. Remember, this was days before PC, so you wrote a lot of stuff. Yeah. And then he'd sit in front of me with a red pen and / cancel everything I wrote. And the point he made to me was that in business communication, you need to be very focused, keep it simple, get your point across, but nobody has time to read reams and reams of stuff. Now, I was writing like I was writing fiction and prose. And so he taught me the power of simplicity and focus and keeping your written communication simple and clear. I took that and extended it later to everything. And that was my one big learning very early on. The power of simplicity in communication. Most organizations, certainly in organizational context, tend to complicate communication. We tend to use jargon. We use words that make sense to us but don't make sense to the average layman. We try to mystify stuff. And the truth is that when you're talking to people, whether it is to a small bunch of people, whether it's to one person, whether it's to large audiences, there's tremendous power in simplicity. So for my whole career, I really focused on that. The written communication, if I think it's looking too garbled and too complicated, I send it back to people saying, please redo it. Make it simple. Write it in language that, a 6th grader can understand. And I do the same in my own communication. When I do talks, for example, I talk to thousands of people at a time. I never work off a prepared text. I don't, memorize stuff. My approach is quite simple. I figure the 3 points I want to make. I have some clarity in my head. What message do I want to communicate? And then I just speak like I would speak to any one person, saying, this is what I need to get across to you. The power of communication is that you have to simply communicate an idea and make it relevant to your audience. And so you've got to be thoughtful about who's your audience and how is it relevant to them. But there's tremendous power in simplicity. And I learned that very early in my banking career. So keep it simple, stupid, as they say.
I like what you mentioned about keeping it simple. What are some thought processes that all of us can go through to simplify things that we want to communicate?
I do think what I said just now is a good way to start. Try and keep it first of all. What are the 3 things you want to communicate? Or to? I rarely even get to 4 because the human mind can't keep track of a lot more than that. So I try to crystallize what are the 3 most important things that the audience or the listener should take away from this. And I put those down. That these are the three messages I want to convey. And then once I'm clear about that, sometimes I might add for my own thinking, what are the facts or some of the anecdotes I could narrate to amplify my point. But I really anchor it off those 3 points. The second thing I focus on, which is quite helpful, is milestoning. So especially if you're doing a long talk, you're doing 15, 20 minutes, people lose track of what you're saying. And frankly, sometimes you lose track of what you're saying. So it's a really good habit to milestone, which is telegraph upfront what it is that you're trying to do, and then telegraph along the way that this is where I've got to, this is the point I've made, now I'm moving on to the next stage. These are the milestones of your communication. And I find this helpful in the written form as well, but it's definitely helpful in the spoken form. Keep it simple and milestone it as you go along.
Thank you so much for sharing. The milestones are really important so that people can actually keep track. And it's not just for people, but I think for ourselves as well, that we can keep track of what we are saying. And you being a leader in many of these organizations and places, you communicate a lot. Were there times where you had to have difficult conversations as well? How do you do that as a leader?
Yeah, it happens all the time. And by the way, so it's a good segue, Alistair. You've got to make sure that you're communicating by and large to an audience who's mentally prepared to accept your communication. And to do that, you've got to be able to seed the ground. So when having difficult conversations, there's a trick I learned long ago. It's called the feedback sandwich. So like you have a sandwich, right? You have bread on top, then you have the beef or the ham in between, and then you have bread at the bottom. You got to start and do the equivalent of that in a difficult conversation. Start first with recognizing something good. No matter how bad a person is or how severe the challenge is, you can always find something positive. And we start with acknowledging something positive. It lets the listener believe that you're being objective, that you're not just one-sided, you're willing to recognize something good and something positive about the person. Then you deliver the ham, which is this is what you could do better. This is what you need to improve on. And then ideally you wind up with another slice of bread, which is reinforcing and reassuring. So if you do it that way, you come across as being a lot more objective. In fact, not just come across. You actually force yourself to be more objective. So what I do, and frankly, you do this all the time when you're doing appraisals, but I do that in other occasions as well. I always make 2 columns, and I write the positive and I write the negatives. And that allows me to be a lot more balanced in my assessments as well and what I want to say, because then you get a much more nuanced way of making sure that you're, level-handed.
I like what you mentioned about the structure and the framework where you start with something positive and then you put the meat or the feedback in the middle and you wrap it up with something positive again. Do you mind sharing any particular example of what feedback or message did you want to actually give and how did you manage to layer it together, whether is it for an individual or for a large group of audiences?
Well, I had a conversation earlier this morning with an unnamed individual, and I wanted to convey feedback to the person that I expected them to lead in a different way and to lean in on leading, especially cross-country and in a more collaborative way. But I started off first by acknowledging that what this person had been doing in the course of their job had been very good. And I said, I'm a fan of a lot of the things that you're doing. You've turned the business around and you're creating great outcomes. And so the fact that I acknowledged the financial performance that he's created, I acknowledged the fact that the business had turned around, allowed the person to be a lot more receptive and in an open frame of mind to accept the feedback and the development agenda that I was going to ascribe to him. I then went on and told him that this is very good, but you're doing yourself a disservice because you're not collaborating and you're not leaning in. And therefore, all the good stuff that you're doing on your job is going to waste. You're not getting the value of it. And this is what you need to do if you're going to be able to leverage that. And then I wound up by telling him that he has potential to go very far if he can fix this problem. So that was a classic approach of doing a feedback sandwich.
Were there cases where people respond differently from what you expect?
Of
And
course,
what
there
do you
are.
do about that after that?
You've got to be authentic and empathetic. Of course, I've fired people. And so, no matter how well you cushion the communication, people get emotional. Sometimes people get angry. A lot of time, people then start crying in the room. So, you have all kinds of reactions. The main thing you got to do is make sure that you have authenticity, you have empathy, and you're speaking from the heart. If people can see that there's authenticity in what you're saying, you're not making up stuff, they will eventually come around to recognizing the integrity in your comments. I'm, a touchy-feely person. So when things like that happen, I put my arm around somebody, and I'm quite happy to put my arm around somebody and say, look, it's okay. This is a fact, and I have to tell you this, but it doesn't mean it's the end of the world. And I always consciously look at seeing what can I do to make it easier and provide some more support to the person in these difficult times.
And throughout your career, especially in your earlier years, what were some of the feedback that was given to you, and how did you respond to that as well?
In terms of actually communication and people skills, I've always had good feedback. I've always been a people person. One of my early bosses said, you're rough around the edges, and that's because I'm quite direct. And so one of the feedback I was given is that in some circumstances and situations, you might want to be a little more gentle and not be in your face when you say some things. And so I took that on board, but with a little bit of reflection, because I also believe that one of my strengths is I call a spade a spade. So I don't shy away from telling people what's in my mind and what's in my heart. With me, you what you see is what you get. Right?
Thank you so much for sharing. I think that's really wonderful. A great insight to the different experiences that you have. And so we talked about communication, especially in challenging situations. But how about communication in crisis? And we are going to segue into this particular topic right now. Were there situations where it's in a crisis? How was the situation like, and what did you do to communicate effectively in a crisis?
Well, the crisis and crisis, and you got to think about the audience. So the biggest challenge you have is when you want to convey different messages to different audiences all at the same time. And that's when it starts getting really tricky, but it happens. So let me give you a really concrete example. A couple of years ago, we had a few outages in our technology setup. And I had to communicate messages to different people. I had to communicate a message of concern and empathy to our customer base and the public at large. Public was upset, customers were upset, and so I had to make sure they understood that we took it seriously, we were empathetic to the situation, and we were focused on trying to fix it. At the same time, I had a separate stakeholder group, and that was the regulators. The regulators were mad, and so I had to make sure the regulators understood that not only was I contrite, I had a very specific plan and agenda to fix the problem, and that we were going to take accountability. And we're going to try to drive accountability into the system. But I had another third stakeholder group, and that was my employees. And my employees needed to know that while there would be accountability, I would give them air cover to get on and fix the stuff. And I was not going to create scapegoats and go, hounding after people. Now, there are three different constituencies, and I've got at the same time to do a message which satisfies everybody. I'll give you this is my experience. I can tell you another case where this happens all the time. And you see this in geopolitics. Yes. You see a lot of statements from politicians, and those statements they're making because they're dealing with the domestic constituency, the electorate. But at the same time, the statement then gets captured and amplified around the world, and they'll have people from other countries saying, hey, why did you say that? And then the politicians are always dancing, saying this wasn't really meant for you. It was meant for my local people. So this whole idea of, how do you deal with communication gets tricky because of multiple stakeholders. But cutting across all that, I think in a crisis, that is the real job of the leader, to be able to keep people focused and make sure that you're not all over the place. So people have a sense of direction and a sense of what do they need to do. You need to be able to do that while you, for your own people, while making sure people understand the urgency of the situation. So if people don't get the urgency of the situation, if people don't understand that this is a big deal, that you need to do something, you won't get the corrective action, and you won't get the turnaround that you want. But at the same time, you got to do it in a way that you're empathetic to people. And people don't do bad things just because they want to do bad things. Mistakes happen. And so, how do you give people the confidence that you have their back? That it's okay to make mistakes and they don't get crucified all the time because they make a mistake. I think all of these are really important in getting the communication right with your own employees. Like I said, with the customer base, you do have to, apart from being contrite, you have to give them a sense of direction, that what do they need to do, how do we fix the problem, what is the short-term remedy, what is the long-term remedy. So it's about gaining confidence, because the last thing you can afford to do is lose confidence. You need to gain confidence, but also you need to be explanatory. You need to tell them what it is that they need to do. So it, like I said, depends on the circumstance and it depends on the audiences. You have to tailor your message in many, many ways. For most crises, we have what are called, our drawer messages. We predetermine, depending on the nature of crisis, what we might want to say. And we create these messages in advance. We keep them ready. But believe me, I have rarely come across a crisis where I could just take a pre-prepared communication and used it. Because the circumstance is always a little bit different. And so you always have to think a little bit. You can start with the stock, but then you have to start thinking differently about what is it that you need to communicate at this point in time. I'll do a couple of other dimensions. You got to think about increasingly is what is your platform of communication. It's not just the content, it is where do you communicate. What do I mean by that? Is it appropriate for you to put it out on social media? Should you be doing it on your websites? Should you be putting it out on Facebook and WhatsApp? Should you be standing up in front and making a public speech? Should you do a media conference and press release? There are multiple dimensions and different ways you can approach the medium. And each of those different platforms conveys something different. And so you have to be thoughtful not just about the message, but you've got to be thoughtful about the platform you will use to convey the message. And in doing that, you've got to balance a lot of things. What is the immediacy of the message? If it's urgent and immediate, you don't have a choice. You better go online and you better make sure it's visible very quickly. But at other times, you might not need to be that urgent, in which case you can be a little bit thoughtful and use different mediums to communicate the message. So that's just another dimension of what you need to do in a crisis.
And sometimes in the moment of crisis and when we try to communicate it out, there will be different reactions from everyone around us. How do you ensure that we continue to build trust even after you communicate? Because they can react well and say, I understand, but the adverse or the opposite is also possible, which then they can say you are just communicating for the sake of communicating, or I'm not going to believe what you are going to do because you have already in that mess, for example. So how do you then manage the different reactions after you communicate?
Well, first of all, you've got to be listening. In the bank, we have a whole apparatus to do social media listening. So if you're not listening to what people are saying, you never know how people are responding. So I think a large part of communication is not just saying, but listening well. So what is the nuance? Now, once you've listened, then you have choices. Right? You can choose whether you want to respond and repeat the message, but try it in a different medium and different content. You can alternatively choose to show it by your actions. And instead of focusing on saying the same thing again, demonstrate progress, because then you can go back and say, see, I told you I would do this. I've not finished it, but I've got so far. Because then you start winning some credibility because you're actually moving in a particular direction. And there's sometimes when you just ignore it. And you ignore it because there's a lot of outrage, but you know the outrage will die.
Yes.
Right? And therefore the troublemakers, the fringe groups, you cannot respond to everybody and everything, because that actually kindles the flames. So sometimes it is just more sensible to say we're just going to wait a day or two and watch things die down, and then we can be a lot more constructive in getting the right message across.
I like what you mentioned as well, to listen. And communication is not just about speaking or saying what we want to say, but listening. And we are going to segue into this topic on listening. What are your thoughts on how can we all listen better in an environment that has so many different voices, so many things are moving and changing around? But as a leader, even though we have so many things to say, how can we listen better?
Well, there's a lot of programs and courses, the gurus who teach you about active listening. How do you actually listen actively?
Correct.
Listen to emotions, listen to body language, listen to subtle signs, listen to learn how to read between lines. So it's a skill that you can practice. But it does mean giving people the time to articulate what they want to say. The challenge for many of us is that we're always rushing to get our thoughts out, as opposed to waiting to hear what other people's contribution or ideas are. And that's an acquired skill. The patience to sit back and just let people have the time and space to finish what it is that they want to say. Technology helps. So one of the biggest things that is happening today is generative AI and natural language processing. And one of the best things about that is that the computer helps you make sense from the noise. I just finished saying that, there are hundreds of people speaking, lots of outrage. You can't figure, is there a fringe group or is there a resonant theme? But today, technology lets you do that very intelligently, whether the spoken word or the written word. NLP and Gen AI will just go through reams of conversations and pull out for you and say, these are the 3 themes that you need to focus on. And they will do that equally for the written word. We're doing that increasingly now. We apply all Gen AI and NLP to all our call center. And we have hundreds and thousands of calls. As the CEO, I would never know what is it that people are saying. We get tons of social media queries. It's very hard for me to go through that noise and say, what is the essence of the communication that I should be listening to. Today, technology lets you do it. And it picks together and says, okay, these are the 3 things. And then you can actually ruminate over it and respond appropriately.
Wow. That is what innovation actually does. And I guess that it helps us to really consolidate a lot of information so that we can listen better and more effectively as well. I guess this is a wrap. So one last question for you. Any advice for young people, youths who are going through their career journey and eventually taking leadership positions? Any advice for all of us?
I think communication is probably the single most underrated skill. And as we go into the world of tomorrow with more and more AI, Gen AI, etc., the art of being able to inspire people, inspire audiences, both with your written word as well as your spoken word, is going to be super critical. And like everything in life, these are acquired skills. Practice makes perfect. And so particularly in the spoken word, I tell people, start speaking early. Speak in a room. Speak in front of people. You'll get butterflies in the stomach. You won't know how to do it. You won't be good a few times. But you know what? After 3, 4, 6 times, your confidence builds. And you start getting better and better. So I encourage people, join Model United Nations. Go do extemporary speaking. Do public debate. Try every opportunity you can to learn how to speak and to express yourself, because you can only get better by doing it.
One last question. Where and how did you learn to start to speak?
I used to debate a lot in school. So I started very early.
Wow. Thank you so much, Piyush, for joining us on the show today. We really appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks so much, Alistair. Enjoyed it.
So you heard it well from Piyush. Let us continue to practice and start early in terms of communication. And it's not just about speaking, but listening effectively as well. I hope that many of us really learned a lot from today's session. Well, that's all for now. I'm Alistair, and we'll see you again soon.